lifetime trustee of the Aspen Institute. My husband, Joe, who is here, and I have sponsored this book series now for over 10 years. And we are delighted, absolutely, to have what we consider today one of the most special programs, if not the most special, that we have had for our book series. So it gives me a tremendous amount of pleasure to introduce this program today, featuring Dr. Simon Schama, and the author of The Story of the Jews and numerous other publications, and our guest moderator today, interviewer, Jeffrey Brown, who is the senior correspondent for art, culture, and society on PBS NewsHour. You have before you the biographies of these two gentlemen, and in the interest of time, because what they have to say is more important than my introduction. But I will say that last night was one of the most thrilling evenings that I've had in watching.
You need to get out a bit more, I think.
Yeah.
But thank you.
Well, she didn't actually say what she did.
That's true. That's true.
Let's wait.
That's true.
Let's wait to hear.
Yeah, that's pushing my luck.
Yeah, really.
Yeah, so you were thrilled by something or someone. Yeah.
I'm still thrilled. But last night was a marvelous, marvelous evening, the two-part documentary of The Story of the Jews. I must say that I am in the midst of reading the book, but last night, the documentary and Simon Schama brought it to life for me. And I was just sorry when those 2 hours were up, because it was totally thrilling. It's not only the story of the Jews, it's the story of civilization as we know it and the development of monotheistic religions, but it is the story of the Jews. And I cannot tell you how much I enjoyed it. And I know that it's available in the book, and there are videos that you can buy, and it's going to be streamed online right now. So I encourage you not only to buy it, but to enjoy it and to learn. It's all about us. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you all for coming, and I'm pleased to be back here at Aspen for one of these book conversations and also at other events I've been at. So thank you for having me here. And it's a pleasure to be here with Simon Schama. He is, won't go through all of his doings, but just to say that he is my kind of historian, I guess, or public thinker. Someone who's trying to speak to a large general audience on television every night. It's a pleasure to read him, listen to him, talk to him, to someone who knows how to take on big subjects and speak to a large audience of people like myself, and no doubt you, who are not scholars and experts, but are interested parties. He's taken on a lot of different subjects, of which you know, art history, culture, all kinds of historical areas. This one is a very large subject, and it comes in two parts. It is the book, The Story of the Jews, Part 1 is out. It's Finding the Words, 1000 BC to 1492 AD, and properly placed on PBS, I should say, is the 5-part series, The Story of the Jews. So what we're going to do is have conversation. We're going to show you a few clips, and then we're going to open it up for some questions, okay? So my first, not to be impertinent right at the start here, but when I first heard about this project, my first thought was, does the world need another story of the Jews? Why? What interested you?
Well, some of the answer to that is the other half of me, the British half of me, the European half of me. I mean, I pay my taxes here, in case there's anybody from the IRS. My residence is here, but a lot of the work I do, particularly television work, often originates with the BBC. In fact, very sweetly, Anshel Pfeffer, a wonderful writer for Haaretz, reviewing the series, said Simon Schama's done an absolutely terrible thing. He's robbed Israel of being able to accuse the BBC of being anti-Semitic. But I was, although this project was rattling around, I mean, it has been aired. That's another thing entirely from it actually being commissioned. And so I was really rather astonished when, on the back of actually finishing a 4-part series made during the year of Barack Obama's election called The American Future History, when this executive phoned me up and said, he actually said, I've got a project you'll either love to do or I won't be hearing from you for a long while. You tell it to be both. And I knew before we had the drink the following day it was going to be this. And I thought, I gulped. As the preface in the book explains, I was actually commissioned 40 years ago. There has to be something biblically significant in that, to complete a book by the great, indomitable and rather austere Anglo-Jewish historian Cecil Roth. I was a young whippersnapper then, but I ran a seminar in Jewish history with my friend Nicholas Delange at Cambridge. But something really about, I couldn't make my style of approach work with his. I also wasn't really remotely, I may not be competent now, but I definitely wasn't competent then. And there was also the other sense that, when we were growing up as baby historians in the 60s, really, it was drilled into us that you really had to have distance. It was often a much better thing. Instead, if you wrote your own history, that was always history as the genealogy of the wonderfulness of us, something which American historians are not totally innocent of. Not all of them, but once upon a time.
Does that mean they're guilty of it?
As the original, a much better House of Cards says, that's that's for you to say. I couldn't possibly comment. So I was one of those anyway who decided that history in any case is a kind of keeping company with people who are removed from you in time and space. Right. So I thought I wanted to be really removed from me, even though Jewish history was the first history I knew. So I did I was interested in French history and Dutch history and so on. So this was a kind of, but when the BBC came out, and there's so much ignorance, there is a growing tide of anti-Semitism in Europe. It's not, I do want to correct what I often hear in New York and the United States, that we're in sort of Weimar 1931 or something. I think we're not. But it would be very naive to not see that anti-Zionist polemics are now fully leaked into loathsomely archaic anti-Semitic stereotypes. That is a problem. So, and I think part of the problem, finally an answer to your excellent question, Jeffrey, is that if you're making serious and Jewish history, which you hope Jews will enjoy, and there are things that I think also weren't available to Abba Iban. Wonderful, wonderful series, but the archaeology has changed, the art history has changed. If you're making it for, hopefully for a non-Jewish audience as well, and that's certainly the idea of both the book and the film series, there are only 250,000 Jews in Britain, then the problem is very often Jewish history is just about the Holocaust, the Shoah, and about the Middle East conflict, or the two bundled together.
Or at least as a kind of central focus.
Yes, well, I think actually the reaction it provokes, less in America again, but certainly in Europe, is that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the only way to join it is with extreme polemics usually, or that's, it shouldn't be. And the only way, how do you respond to the Shoah, except either you deny it, which almost nobody does, or you simply you observe it in deferential silence. And my history has always been rather kind of history of noisy engagement. So I wanted to try and find a kind of invitational window which made it more complex, richer, less a kind of perpetual martyrology. I mean, this is not a smiley face history. That would be very over, counter-corrective, but
Well,
that's what I want to do.
So you raised a number of things that I want to make sure we come back to, including the situation with anti-Semitism today and the Israeli Palestinians. But to come back to this project as you took it on now, this is a kind of personal project. And you say early on, you got to forgive me because now sometimes I get confused about the film and the book because I've been doing both. I think it's in the film. You say early on, this story is what made me want to be a historian in the first place.
Yeah, that's true.
So tell us about that. But then when you're taking on a project like this, you are injecting, you don't have the historian's distance that you've had in most of your other work.
No. The first point is that, as I say in the film, I was born in '45. I was actually born the night of the Dresden raids. Houses on either side of the little kind of, what do you call it, mini hospital in Welbeck Street were demolished by V2 bombs, but Luftwaffe didn't get me, and what was left of it. And but the non-facetious point is that as a child, I was walked around by my father in the kind of heroic ruins of London. And we lost some family on my mother's side in Vienna early on after the Anschluss. And my father was a huge history buff. Shakespeare was his thing, but Churchill was his thing. And on his bookshelf, I remember seeing, when I was 7 or something, Chaim Weizmann's Trial and Error next to Churchill's History of the English-speaking Peoples. And my father was indivisibly English and Jewish. And for him, it was not an accident that Churchill was both a kind of Zionist, as far as you could be, and be a British politician, and a working historian. And that some sense, Churchill's words on that crucial day, 2 days in May in the cabinet meetings, had made a difference. But Churchill could only have arrived at those words, which were fatefully connected with how British Jews survived the war, by the fact that he was determined, as he said, if not fight them on the beaches, to sort of defend Britain to the last. And so there was a sense, actually, that there is two histories, Jewish history and British history, that have been really badly hurt by the war, to put it at its most understated, but had not been annihilated. And that those two histories were in some peculiar way linked, and also that the actual doing of history, the internalizing of history, was itself a kind of resistance. No accident that Olivier's Henry V was almost a kind of quasi-governmental commission during the war, although we were starting to win the war at that point. So my dad had this sense in which history, as I've said a lot, was not just a kind of stroll down memory lane. I've nothing against the kind of, the sort of the Downton Abbey, although it's been said, if we did the Jewish version, because I've been called already the Downton Rabbi, actually. But I don't mind that. But history, the honor of history, from the time Herodotus and particularly Thucydides invented it, was the very, very high stakes, not just a kind of antique furniture polish in order to ornament the dullness of our contemporary civilization. Survival is at stake. In Thucydides' case, the survival of Athenian democracy. Now, the second point is that Thucydides,
was a general as well.
He was a that
goes to our second question, our second point
exactly,
of someone who was a
Jeffrey.
participant.
He was a forcibly retired general for having allegedly bungled the Northern Front, and every time I revisit that, I'm very struck by it, because actually, even though, and I wish it weren't so, most core curriculums in college syllabuses around the country extract from the Peloponnesian Wars the Pericles' famous speech, a very grand, if fancifully semi-invented piece of rhetoric. But the magnificence of that book, which I recommend to you if you haven't read it lately, is designed to build to this shattering climax of the botched expedition to Syracuse. And it is this kind of hubris-laden catastrophe, which Thucydides is always kind of aiming at all through the other debates as a chastening moment. But exactly as you say, some of the, it's a very hard book, by which I mean kind of flinty, and deliberately cold-blooded, you know, so that when he writes the great passage, incredible sequence about the plague of Athens, he's writing in full kind of technicolor vividness, but it's all the more dramatic because he, you know, you think of him as a fairly kind of fierce and dispassionate figure through some of it. You're right that this is the most personal, but there were moments that the book where I thought this issue, I mean, all history is a negotiation between familiarity and remoteness. On one hand, the past is irrecoverably alien. It is indeed a foreign country. On the other hand, people in it are, to some extent, just like us, and the emotional drive is just like us. So there's always a kind of tricky thing. But the book, actually, where I started to think really very intensely about this was the French Revolution book, Citizens, which I wrote during for the bicentennial year. I wasn't sure I wanted to do it, even though I'd lectured on the French Revolution. And what I did when I was thinking about it was go to the books that had been written in the centennial year in 1889. And a lot of those books were written, you know, multi-volume, so they were written with the full heat of 19th century romantic passion. They were only 2 or 3 generations out from witnesses. And I thought, there are some things you have to do from proximity, actually, providing you know when to pull back a little bit. Right. So I always teach my students that, you know, you have to, in some sense, reenact inside yourself. It's not my kind of, you know, phrase. It's the phrase of the great philosopher R.G. Collingwood. You have to kind of imaginatively reenact being there, and then bring all of your analytical rationality, you hope, to what you have in front of you. Now, even though there's a lot of me and a lot of, you know, my own personal reflections in this, and a certain amount, much less in the book. I hope there's also a lot of, you know, careful, analytical, calm is not quite the right word, is it? But scrutiny. Yeah.
Let me ask you one more subject thing, and then we'll look at the first clip. If there is a kind of running theme, I think it is, well, it's the subtitle, the words, finding the words. And the suggestion seems to be that, in fact, Jewish survival, and you go through all the periods, reasons why it should not have survived, Jewish survival is in fact grounded in words, in books, in the story. Is that what you came to conclude?
It sure is, yeah. I mean, if you think about it, the Bible used to be thought it was written just during the Babylonian exile from the 6th century onwards, but really most scholars, I say this with trepidation, but most scholars seem to be agreed that the Bible begins to be written in the 8th century BC. In other words, when the Judean kingdom is still happening on the reign of King Josiah, for example. But it's, you know, the kingdom of Israel has been destroyed in the Josiah period is 6th century BC. The kingdom of Israel has been destroyed in the 8th century BC. There is no time when the Bible's not being written either in a state of siege or a state of extreme nervousness, poised between the enormous juggernaut powers of the Mesopotamian kingdoms, first Assyria and then Mesopotamia, and then Babylonia, or Egypt, you know, the great juggernaut. So it's not that the Bible is written, I would say, defensively, but there is always the sense, I think, partly because of the influence on Judah, the little kingdom to the south, of what had happened to the much more ostensibly powerful kingdom of Israel to the north. All those great fortresses, Megiddo and so on, were part of the kingdom of Israel, not the kingdom of Judah. There was the sense, and I talk about it a lot in the book, where the parts of the Bible I'm really interested in is when the book itself is a kind of star of its own narrative. There was the sense that hieroglyphic monuments in the Egyptian style, colossal Egyptian style, and linear B standing stone legal inscriptions, Mesopotamian style, wouldn't kind of work for a kind of people that was likely to be on the run or likely constantly to have to make shift in some improvised way. And what the scribal generations and the redactors do is to create this extraordinarily rich vernacular it has its great poetic moments with the prophets, but so much of it is actually God walking among men and women like us. So much of it is earthy, but above all, it's written in a simple 22-letter linear alphabet, the West Semitic, Canaanite, then Hebrew alphabet, and on portable scrolls. The one thing which is special about early Judean Israelite culture is that you can take it with you, and that's been the case over and over again. We memorize it, we internalize it, we say it in synagogues. It's not a kind of fixed real estate kind of religion.
But do you have a theory about why Jews from then to now have privileged the word or the book, and somehow has allowed the survival?
Well, I don't think it's the other way around. It's that once actually the Epiphany, the founding Epiphany, not including Abraham, assuming that we're talking about the Mount Sinai, it's coming up for Pesach, the Passover, let's call it, Moses, the revelation on Mount Sinai as the formative Epiphany. The very first author is God, because since his finger actually writes the Ten Commandments and so on. The sense in which actually words are holy. There's a wonderful book which we allude to in the fourth program, actually, I think it is, and which is a pre-Kabbalist mystical book, called the Book of Creation, the Sefer Yetzirah, where the delightful legend occurs in which God creates the universe out of Hebrew letters. Actually, the letters themselves sort of implode and create elements of water and fire and air and earth and so on. That is so adorable. It doesn't really answer the why question. It just sort of happens that way, and then that is what is compulsively, retained. So that I don't know how many of you are Jewish here, but if you've been to synagogue on a Saturday or on a festival day, you'll know that what is processed around, what is revered, what is kissed, is a book, essentially, is a scroll book. But of course, those processions were pagan processions. They were the image of the king, god, lawgiver in Mesopotamia and other places. They were triumphal pagan processions with images of pagan deities before, whom one prostrated or bowed or crooked the knee. And in every place where there is a kind of pagan protective element, for example, we know that before there were mezuzot, the little bits of the Schama on the doorpost made of words, you stuck in ancient pagan world. One of the standard things you did to keep away the demons and the bad elements and monsters out there was to put a miniature version of protective deity, of Horus or Osiris or something like that. So you can only say it happens to an astonishing, and for once the word is right, uniquely compulsive way in Jewish culture, and then it becomes the thing itself by which you survive. I mean, there was a wonderful, it's not in the film, but one bond I certainly have in book volume 2 I'm writing is a man called Emanuel Ringelblum, who was because he was a historian, he was the sort of favorite pupil of the great Polish nationalist Jewish historian Simon Dubnow. And Ringelblum, finding himself in the ghetto and knowing he's not going to survive, he was part of a group who were going to lead the uprising in April 1943, gathered a group of kids and students. They called themselves Oyneg Shabbos, which is a Yiddish version of preparing for Shabbat, kind of informal conversation and celebration of the coming Shabbat. But what they were doing was collecting the records of the apartment blocks in the ghetto, who were being run by an organization called Alleinhilf, Help Yourself, You're on Your Own, appropriately. And the Alleinhilf were the people you went to and you didn't want to go to the official Jewish committee of the Judenrat, who were appointed by the Nazis. So the Alleinhilf, being Jews, in the middle of incredible privation, every 5 o'clock was a committee meeting. But it was a committee meeting with a purpose. It was how many children were dying, were there school books, where were old people, had all the dead been gathered, really terrible things, but they were committees. And again, being Jewish committees, they were constantly having political arguments as well, still in the midst of horror. And at the end, Ringelblum and his friend, Israel Lichtenstein, decided that they were going to conceal these records, some of you may know this story, in milk churns and bury them and Liechtenstein wrote the most extraordinary letter that survived, and he said, I only wish I could be there the day when the Oyneg Shabbos records were brought to light, so that the world will know what we've gone through. We have not endured, but our archive will have endured. And in 1950, miraculously, one fellow called Hirschwasser, who only survived by jumping off the train as it was going to Treblinka and joined partisans, amazingly survived the war. He led people to the underground cache where the milk churns were buried in 1950. Do we have any Chinese diplomats among us? What a pity, because there are more underneath the Chinese embassy in Warsaw. But somehow, I don't think actually we're going to be able to dig there.
No, I don't think so.
Do you have connections, Jeffrey?
I don't think so. So let's look at it. Let's look at a clip. This is from one of the later episodes, right?
This is the opening of Program 4, and there is a point to it. I think, are we going to be in the... Yeah, there it is.
Okay.
Good.
Okay.
At first, it seemed like a place of utter desolation. But then I saw them, the stylized angel's wings hovering over the ceiling. Out of the dust burst the colors, the blues of heaven, the reds of the kings of Judah, the rainbows coming through the glass. And then, amidst all this absence, I began to sense the presence, the cantor's chant, the murmuring banter. And there in the galleries were the women of Jewish Koshitze, and down below the men in silks and hats. In the spring of 1944, 15,700 Jews from Koshitze, the entire community, were sent to their deaths in Auschwitz. But this wasn't a place that sat passively, waiting for its death sentence. Before the Holocaust, Koshitze, like thousands of Jewish towns and villages strung across Central and Eastern Europe, was alive, thriving, confident, noisy. The opera and the klezmer, the schnorrer beggars and the prosperous merchants, the pushcart peddlers and the street corner revolutionaries. That this world somehow flourished despite all the pounding storms that would come its way is an escape act so epic that it counts as one of history's all-time redeeming miracles. Even when systematic annihilation overwhelmed the people, the world that had nourished them survived. This is the story about how this unique culture of faith and ferment, of poetry and music, of a search for deliverance from brutality and oppression, did not get pulverized by the hammer of history. It just changed its address.
Well, we didn't discuss beforehand which clip we're going to show, but that does give a sense of the mix of achievement and struggle that runs throughout everything I've seen of the 5 episodes.
Yeah, I think, certainly, the fact of what happened in Koshitze is of incomparably tragic importance. But what I was so struck by in that synagogue, that was somewhat improvised piece to camera, really, was this extraordinary color. And it was clear to me, actually, from the windows, which you saw just a tiny glimpse of, we had much more footage, was that those windows were art moderne windows. They were windows from the Bohemian, Moravian, modernist art. And indeed, it was an Orthodox synagogue, but that not only did it not prevent there being a genuine collaboration between architects, craftsmen. You would expect it in Slovakia in a way, and in Bohemia, but it actually encouraged it. So there was a sense actually of a joint world. There were a lot of ugliness and horror. Slovakia became, of course, a satellite state of the Nazis. That's why the deportations to Auschwitz were so late. But Košice was indeed a place which had its own organic vitality. If you flip the martyrology, not waiting for your destruction, then what you have is a kind of intense urgency about Jewish life in Central and Eastern Europe, and indeed in the German-speaking lands. So, as I say, without being kind of, superficially smiley-faced about Jewish history, you really do want to get the balance between that the urgency of creativity in Jewish life, and ultimately the things that it can't quite overcome. But as I say at the end, without being at all facetious, so much of the creativity, Program 4 ends, the last 20 minutes are in New York. A lot becomes simply, in a surprising and interesting way. It's politics, it's music, you know the whole story. Gets transferred to the United States.
Well, your description of seeing the color in that synagogue makes me wonder, were there other surprising moments or figures in Jewish history, things or people that maybe you didn't come in knowing so much about, that kind of...
No, in general, it occurred to me when I was being all this kind of wordy stuff, that it would make great radio. And but
except the BBC showed up with cameras, right?
You know, my dear friend, that actually art plays an extraordinarily important part in Judaism. And the more we know about, the more synagogues during the first half millennium of the life of synagogues following the destruction of the temple, the more that are uncovered archaeologically, the more we realize how profusely decorated they are. The second commandment was not interpreted by those generations of rabbis and teachers as a prohibition on painting or on images, even on human images. It was interpreted almost entirely as a prohibition against sculpture, because that's what idols were. Even the second part of the second commandment, nor any likeness that is in heaven above or the earth below, was interpreted. Because one of the places that you may have seen last night is Sepphoris. If you haven't been there, those of you who go to Israel, Sepphoris, is an astonishing place, but it's not the only place, because the crucial thing about Sepphoris is it's 6 miles, some of you can see have been there, from Nazareth, and the other part that Sepphoris played, it was where the Mishnah is first redacted. It's not where it's finished edited, but every source we have tells us that's where it began. The Sanhedrin sits briefly in Sepphoris. It is not a super reform institution. It's an absolute shrine of the fiercest beginnings of the rabbinical oral law. The Mishnah becomes the Talmud. And right in the heart of it are these synagogues covered with mosaics, and not just with birds and beasties and abstract decorations, but with Aaron and the bull about to make the first sacrifice, with the Akedah, the sacrifice of Isaac. These are all ritually associated with the cycle of sacrifice and redemption. But then in the middle of it, as in almost all these synagogues, not all of them, but very many of them, is the zodiac wheel. In the middle of it, you have to say, bound to be a very super Orthodox synagogue. The zodiac wheel with the seasons on it, and what I slightly naughtily describe as calendar girls. In the book, they are half undressed women with heavy, serious blingy earrings and hats. So these are real kind of Saks Fifth Avenue girlies. And they represent Tevet and Tammuz and Nisan. I'm in love with Nisan, and as is right, if we ever get Nisan in the spring. And these were not only acceptable, they were thought in some peculiar way to be required. Some of the early synagogues, Bet Alpha, for example, much cruder, almost certainly Jewish mosaicist, actually has, very often in the middle you have an image where you have the tetragrammaton, God's name, but you have Helios, the sun god, in the middle, because it is the zodiac wheel. And usually you just have a burst, rather Akhenaton-like burst of solar rays, or you have some idealized version of the sun. Sometimes you actually have the figure of Helios himself in his chariot of horses. He's an early version he's an alternative version of Apollo or Phaeton. This is really extraordinary. This is a huge adjustment. In the one place we couldn't film, I wanted to, you would have come with me, was in Syria. Because in the Damascus Museum are these astounding wall paintings, 40 of them, from the great Jewish synagogue at Deir Europos. This is a 3rd century synagogue, very, very early on. And there we have dry fresco, Moses, David, Samuel, Mordecai and Esther. These are spectacular images. So they are being painted, and this was a synagogue to which people came from near and far as well. That we know from inscriptions actually underneath and in the paintings sometimes. So again, not a place which is kind of shockingly unorthodox in Judaism. This is a kind of absolutely extraordinary thing. It's the only synagogue we know of that has full-on paintings. But it's being created exactly at the same time as Christian iconography is being created. It's not even clear whether Byzantine icons didn't actually get the idea from Jews rather than the other way around. Stick that in your yarmulke. It all changes around 600, I think, as a response to Islam. Islam is much stricter in all sorts of things than we ever were until then. That's a possibility.
Now I love how we're switching from light to dark and back and forth. Now I want to go back to dark, because we were talking earlier about the question of survival. To turn that question around, why have Jews been the subject of so much hatred for so long? That is, outsiders, feared, despised, pushed into ghettos, expelled altogether a number of times from different places, and all the way into, of course, the gas chamber. What explains? This is a big, we'll get to where we are today with anti-Semitism, but what do you think explains that?
Well, it starts upsettingly early before Christianity. So it clearly was not, was unhelpful to be held responsible for crucifying the Savior, but it starts before that. For example, we know Tacitus believed the detestable Appian, who was the 2nd century Alexandrian grammarian, who concocted the story that which Flavius Josephus in his Contra Appionis tries to disabuse Rome and so on. The story that Jews actually were in the habit of ambushing traveling Greek merchants, hijacking them and feeding them up, locking them up and giving them lots to eat, so that they then would, the Greek at a certain time, Jews would be invited from mysterious places around the Roman realms to a kind of basically a barbecue of Greek merchant in the woods, And so these really loathsome, insane kind of demonologies start very, very early. So that's obviously spectacularly not to answer your question. But I think what I would say again, subspecie aeternitas, is that most of powerful dominant cultures have as a part of their sense of who they are and this obviously goes for the Jews, but they in terms of the land of Israel, but they lose it very quickly. Most other cultures have a sense of blood and soil, or a particular place, or they have a myth anyway of their ethnic homogeneity.
Right.
And because of what historically happens to the Jews are wanderers. They are what one very good Russian historian of modern Jewry called Mercurians. That's to say, they live on the edge of the known world. Their families are extended over enormous geographical distances. They learn how to keep connections over geographical distances. They speak many languages. They know how to trade in many places, and so on. And the fixed worlds of territories and castles and empires and palaces and armies needs these people who negotiate with realms that are not theirs, but they are necessarily thought of as dangerously fugitive and unstable, and to some extent never really part of the home society. And this doesn't matter if when you get rid of them, they vanish. But Jews don't vanish. They keep on coming back, whatever happens to them, as that last clip said. And there is a really wonderful book that that is at the beginning of volume 2 and not in the series at all, written by one, Morano, who, like countless hundreds of thousands, reverts to Judaism as soon as he can. He reverts in the city of Ferrara, which is one of the great, should be enshrined in every young Jewish boy and girl's education as a place of extraordinary freedom and tolerance in the 16th century, because of the Este aristocratic family, unusual in Italy then. And his name is Samuel Usque. And Samuel Usque had been part of an amazing underground railroad. I mean, it's crude to call it that, but it's easier as a short term, which existed to get Marranos who are heading for freedom out of Lisbon safely, and usually via London, where there were Jews, and Antwerp. And then there was a kind of series of stages by which you went from Antwerp down the Rhineland, usually, and over the Alps. You were led by people who were called conductores, literally conductors, who found a safe route, would try and get you through the heavily policed Lombard Valley towards either Ferrara or Mantua or Venice, and then onwards to the safety of the Ottoman Empire. Anyway, Samuel Usque writes, he ends up in Turkey as well, but he writes a book in Portuguese called Consolations of the Israeli, for the consolation for the tribulations of the Jewish people. So it is a story of what he'd witnessed on the Alps, women dying, giving childbirth in freezing conditions and so on. It's incredibly moving. But he says at the end, we all think, and Christians certainly think, that our dispersion is a punishment for the crime, as they say, of the passion, of the crucifixion. But God, and we lamented ourselves because it's put us in exile all over the world. But here's the thing, God has so designed this is the way we should think about it, that if we are oppressed and persecuted and massacred in one place, there will always be somewhere else to go to, somewhere else we can go and start all over again. It's a terribly modern sentiment if you're, trying to find a glimpse of light in all that darkness, and it's incredibly moving to see this sort of understood, or the desperate case being made in 1554. But there is this sense of somehow how to recover, as in the last sense of that clip, somewhere else. But that is really, there is no society which is not edgy with such people who, partly because you survive by networking, but it's also true of South Asians in Uganda. It's true of, used to be true of Chinese in Singapore and so on. I mean, there are plenty of other peoples who, Armenians, God knows,
I was just thinking, your mention of Ferrara, Italy, if I think I'm right, fast forward is the setting for the Gardens of Finzi-Contini.
Yes, indeed it is. Yeah.
Which, of course, ends in another disastrous time.
Yes, alas.
So you were saying earlier that are we in a new era of anti-Semitism rising in Europe? Or what are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're, the problem is that certainly the case in Britain, is certainly the case in France too, that there's kind of unholy alliance, really, between a kind of ancient, old-fashioned, in Britain it's a kind of romantic Arabism, really. Goes back to the admirers of Lawrence. I mean, sort of faintly nose-holding golf club anti-Semitism, but it's an alliance with the intensely pro-Palestinian, not pro-Palestinian, intensely anti-Zionist left. So there is this sort of strange, I think actually anti-Semitism in the Europe that I know, from kind of Germany through France to Britain to Holland, is weirdly, and I suppose unbelievably depressingly, a kind of, we shouldn't call it intellectual, but it's something, apart from hardcore neo-Nazi thugs, It's more a kind of horrible, permissive culture in the life of the chattering classes, not actually something which really grips. You don't really find working class anti-Semitism in London unless it's part really of a neo-Nazi organisation, which are tiny. Yeah. That's what's sort of upsetting, but it can be exaggerated. It's sort of not in that sense like Vienna in 1900 or France at the time of the Dreyfus case, but it is really poisonous. And also, of course, actually, well, it wasn't a mistake, I guess. There was a volume of essays about 10 years ago by Ron Rosenbaum about the new anti-Semitism. It called itself that, but new anti-Semitism is very retreads and old. And I, stupidly, for my own mental health, volunteered to do anti-Semitism on the web, and I spent, the most horrible month of my life, I think, actually. You just really stick your foot in the ground and shit comes boiling up. It is really just beyond belief how out there it is, and how foul and totally unrevised.
Did it come in reaction to your film in Britain at all?
No. I mean, no. And Palestinians, bitterly disagreed, although we have about, it's not, I mean, I do say these things which were regarded as an astonishing thing to say, as in, I am a Zionist. But I've always been a two-state Zionist since I was a teenager in Habonim. I always believed in a Palestinian state and a Jewish state. I still do. It's what Ariel Sharon believed in at the end, too. So the Palestinians had their differences and said, now we really must have a kind of Palestinian story of the Palestinians. Why not? But actually, no, I had a problem with the Azajews. You know about the Azajews? Okay, someone at a big and vast majority, just because Jewish population is so thinly distributed, so most of my audiences were incredibly generous and receptive and not Jewish. And then at Ely, an unlikely place, which still has some Jews came from Cambridge, someone gets up and the first words out of her or his mouth is, as a Jew, and they're going to attack Israel at that point, actually. So it's always, as a Jew, I have to say that Israel is a violation of Jewish ethics. So there were a lot of as Jews around. And I had trouble with that.
We have one more clip. Let's take a look at that, and then maybe we'll open it up for your questions, okay?
I was born in 1945. Before I was out of short trousers, I knew about those other boys, the boys of the ghettos and camps, the ones who never got to be bar mitzvahed. My bar mitzvah party was just around the corner from here. Back then, I hadn't heard of Shmuel Ziegelboim, a Polish Jew who lived in this part of West London between the springs of 1942 and 1943, the year when 3 million other Polish Jews were murdered. Ziegelboim had escaped from the Warsaw Ghetto, charged with the grave mission of alerting the Allies to the brutal mistreatment of Jews in occupied Europe, to the massacres that followed Nazi arrival, to the plans for a wholesale annihilation. He spent 18 months in America addressing rallies trying to rouse the conscience of politicians now that information about the Nazis' extermination plans was becoming irrefutable and all to little effect. Then Ziegelboim went back to Britain and spoke on the BBC, saying things you don't usually hear on the BBC. He said this: "It would be a crime and a disgrace to go on living, to belong to the human race, unless immediate action is taken to stop the greatest crime ever known to human history." In April 1943, an SS operation to liquidate the Warsaw Ghetto ran into fierce armed Jewish resistance. The first major rising against Nazi rule in occupied Europe. It took the SS a month to crush it, Many of the leaders of the uprising were Ziegelboim's friends and comrades. And among those who perished were Ziegelboim's wife and son. At exactly the same time, British and American diplomats were meeting in Bermuda to discuss the plight of wartime refugees. The words Jew and Jewish were banned from the proceedings. After 10 days of talk, the Allies decided to do nothing. But Shmuel Ziegelboim acted. He wrote a letter to the Polish government in exile and to the world saying, "My comrades fell with their arms in their hands. It was not permitted to me to join them, but I belong to their mass grave." The Holocaust put paid to the idea that when facing annihilation, the Jews had any reason to expect much in the way of protection, succor, or asylum from anyone. Expressions of concern, yes, but not what you'd actually call saving lives. So it was not just what the Nazis did to the Jews, but what everyone else failed to do that made the moral case for Israel.
You know, I want to just ask one more question before we open it up, because it interests me, I guess, about you, not about the film. Your voice in books is a historian. Your voice on in films, there's the I, you know, I, this. There's you are the main character telling the story. Do you like going back and forth? Are they two sides of you, or how do you think about the different work, or are they different at all?
Yeah, that's certainly the case. I mean, I hope it's a kind of complementary schizophrenia, really. But I think it's been said about my writing that it's, you know, it's. I mean, particularly landscape and memory, which some people like, and I certainly loved writing, that there is a certain amount, as I was saying about Citizens, the French Revolution book, of kind of personal projection. But you're basically right. I think it's this, that it's simply a matter of the scale of the two possibilities, and this is certainly true of the book, which I really hope you'll all read and enjoy, because there will be an exam next week. We talked about this, right? What I've never believed in since I started to do television, you know, 50 films ago, was that anybody who knows anything about it, you don't come along, Mr. Professor, with your book and say, right, now film this. They are two nobly and discreetly, utterly different exercises, and writing a script is really different. So with a book, you have all the expansiveness, all the possibility of digressiveness, all the indirection, but above all, you have a huge cast of characters. And so your own personality, embarrassing probably anyway, you know, needs to efface itself. It needs to disappear entirely inside the crowd, actually. And precisely because if you're making good documentaries, I mean, this is not the case with, it's not, I don't work like, you know, the brilliant Ken Burns does at all. My view, and I'm only inheriting that great tradition from Jacob Bronowski and Alistair Cook, and, you know, these kind of authorial essayists of television who were so astonishing, Kenneth Clark, in their days. Since you only have an hour or less than an hour, you have to actually obey, don't you? There is really, as much as in a feature film, a certain kind of narrative arc, actually. Believe you me, if you violate it, if you have too many characters, too many plot lines, too many stories, too many faces, too many dates, if you start an entirely new story at minute 50, people are confused. Confusion is the handmaid of boredom, and boredom is the handmaid of switching to basketball. So you don't bloody well do it.
Well, I don't know about that order, but okay.
But you don't do it. So you learn to obey. So what you are is a kind of mentor guide for people to explore the bigger story if they want to do. And that is itself, as Jeffrey knows, really tricky, because you have to be both authority and companion. If you're too authority-like, then it does seem like a professor giving you homework. If you're too matey, it's creepy, because why should people, it's like somebody boring in a
Come
bar.
along with me.
Yes, exactly. So it's a tricky thing. We keep learning it,
Absolutely.
right? We do.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, let's open this up. I don't know if we're going, do we have microphones, or we just,
It's a
we'll
small
just
room.
talk?
Yeah. Oh, we do have a microphone. Yeah.
How we,
There's a gentleman here. Yeah.
okay.
Oh, okay. Hi.
I just
Yeah.
a brief comment and then my question. My familiarity with the story of the Jews in this context is only watching the first 2 hours last night. But my comment is, it is, within the context of what we've been talking about, it is the most defiantly, unashamedly pro-Jewish presentation within a broad historical framework that I think I have ever seen. That might be too strong, but that I've seen in a long time, and I congratulate you very much on what you've accomplished. My question is that I could not help but notice the names of those people who sponsored the programs.
Oops, yes.
And almost every name there was Jewish, to the best of my knowledge.
It's true, we are an international conspiracy.
Normally,
we do dominate the media, and
no, but I remember,
we do sacrifice children around Easter. Yeah.
From not too many years ago, foundations would be sponsoring programs of this sort, like the Ford Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation, et cetera. And I was wondering if you made an effort to go to these places. Did they say no? How did it work out that none of them ends up being a sponsor?
Honestly, you'd have to ask WNET, our co-producer, that.
You've entered, the ugly world of public broadcasting.
No, I was going to give you
so
a forthcoming answer too, is that we had generous contributions from those names that you saw right away. But the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, when I last looked, is certainly not, a Jewish organization. But that were good, philanthropic, respectable foundations that wanted to put a Jewish story out there. And I do want to come back to your first point, actually, and that it's nice of you to say that, but there are two views, inside the Jewish community you have, and indeed inside Israel, about actually what a kind of, if you like, in your words, pro-Jewish version would be. And one is an overwhelming emphasis on Jews alone. Jews only, rather the emphasis in the end of the last clip, that Jews by themselves ultimately, and my emphasis, especially in the book, but actually is just the opposite, that there are elements in medieval Islamic culture, elements in 19th century Germany, that very often a kind of creative engagement with the world you're immersed in, God knows, in the United States, and certainly in Britain. In other words, that's why I made the project, to say it's all your history too. Jews have never been separated unless they've been forced to be separated. So if it's a lesson in endurance, it's a lesson in endurance through, cultural synergy with other people. And that there are those elements, even though the clips you've seen are slightly kind of tragically overshadowed, which are also at the heart of the series and the project.
My comment was intended as a compliment.
Yeah, I know you know what we prickly Jews are like.
All right, let's go over here. And then
Thank you very much.
We'll here, and then we'll go to the back.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. 3 years ago, I was at the Story of Berlin Museum in Berlin, the history of 900 years of the city's history. And one of the things that struck me in going through from the beginning to the end was that about every 100 years, Jews were kicked out of Berlin. In between, according to the exhibit, in between there were times when they came back in, migrated in, or were actually invited in as merchants to help bolster the economy. Different reasons were given. But then walking around Berlin and seeing how diverse and cosmopolitan it looks today, it just gave me a shiver to think, like it was almost like clockwork every 100 years that this happened. And this made me wonder, as you talk about rising anti-Semitism in Europe today, is this something that it wouldn't quite go that far, Is this something we might expect more of, something further in Eastern Europe, Russia, or
No,
just if you could comment on that?
Yeah, no, I think no to the end of your question. I'm going to give you a very Jewish answer to what you said, namely, it was worse in Vienna. Actually, Berlin, of course, doesn't exist, you know, in the Middle Ages or anything. Actually, there are other expulsions in the Middle Ages. You bet there are. You know, they're chronicled in there, and that the whole issue of why you're expelling them and when is an incredibly important and quite complicated medieval story. I mean, not to give you the whole story, but it happens in Spain. The terrible year for Jews in Spain is 1391, when there's a mass onslaught and almost 100,000 Jews lose their lives in a matter of weeks around Easter. And then another 100,000, about 300,000, these are rough figures, of course, 300,000 Jews in Spain at that time, in Christian Spain. And another 100,000 convert, whether they want to convert or they're terrified, almost more likely the latter. And then the third 100,000 Jews remain as Jews. So, you know, great triumph for the church. It's brought about the conversion of this huge number of Jews, except, you know, the morning after, the church and the friars and indeed some Jewish converts wonder whether or not those converts are now authentically Christian. That's what actually invents the Inquisition. The Inquisition is directed at suspect converted Jews, also suspect converted Muslims, but incredibly few of those. And that's what the Inquisition is. And 1492, the year of the expulsion, that's done by Ferdinand and Isabella because the church then and the friars feel that as long as actual open Jews are there, the converts are always going to be backsliding. And there's no chance actually having a properly converted Jewish population. They were right about that, as a matter of fact, that while there were Jews in Spain. So that's one example. It's different in Germany and so on. Mm-hmm. The German situation is, I mean, I hope you enjoy the third program the first one next week, because I tried very hard to say, because I too, you know, have been to the museum. In fact, we shot there. And notwithstanding that expulsion, and there were no expulsions in Berlin between Frederick William I in the middle of the 18th century and the Holocaust. They're not expelled from, they really aren't, I promise you. And actually what happens to the German Jewish population, if you had to say, if you were standing in Europe and you were a concerned sort of super Jew like Moses Montefiore or someone like that, and you want to say, which is the culture where the Jews are going to make it most quickly, most easily, most emphatically, most phenomenally, it would have been without question Germany, or Prussia, in fact, but you know, other parts of Germany as well. And so they did. You know, I mean, they're out of the ghetto, and in 2 generations, they're newspaper editors, manufacturers, lawyers, doctors, the whole thing. It's the most astonishing moment of modernization. So I tried to make that program without at all undercutting, you know, the horror of what happens and the moment where the shadows fall across German Jewish life. It's very difficult for that museum, which only has 1 Jewish curator, but who's counting. She is wonderful, it's a she too. It's very difficult because, you know, they have to find the artifacts somewhere, and they do have them, but they don't have enough.
All right, let me go back there, and then we'll go over here. So first here.
Thank you. There was a book published a few years ago, On the Eve, which argued that before the Holocaust...
Oh, Bernard Wasserstein's book. Yeah, a friend of mine.
That argues that before the Holocaust, the Jewish community in Eastern Europe was really in serious decline by just about every measure, demographically, economically, culturally, I think. Do you agree with that? Or
I mean, my short
view?
answer is I don't, rather. I mean, I think, I don't know, you know, who's doing the measurements. What, you know, the issue of assimilation and intermarriage is a big deal, but I can't ever think of a moment in any Jewish culture, including our present one in the United States, when this hasn't been a worry and somehow, you know, the culture doesn't disappear. I mean, again, if you look at Poland, and Bernard is a great authority on Poland, you know, in terms of the interest in Yiddish culture, whether you look at I.L. Peretz's, if any of you have not read the short stories of I.L. Peretz, go to them. They are up there with Chekhov. I mean, I'd read them years ago. They're in Yiddish, but they're wonderful, wonderful English translations. You'll have an incredible pleasure. But I mean, I just don't. On the whole, I thought. I just thought, you know, in Holland, which I do know something about, it's absolutely untrue in the Netherlands. And it's even more tragic, you know, because 75% of the Dutch population has about the highest rate of Holocaust victims in the whole of Europe. But it's a vibrant, whether you look in art or design or, I don't know where Bernard was looking, you know, that's a community which is dynamic, really, in the 30s. So I thought he's brilliantly counterintuitive sometimes. So I just didn't quite. It's a very interesting book and it's richly documented, and you should all read it perhaps and make up your own mind.
Okay, let's back.
Did you buy it? You thought it was persuasive? Well, it's bloody depressing, isn't it? Yeah, I know.
Oh, I'm sorry. He gave. Well, first of all, if I recall, it was only about Eastern Europe.
Yes.
Not Western
Yes,
Europe.
that's true. That's true. Yes, yes.
But
how do you actually measure a community that's in phenomenal shock, like Russian Jews, for example? I mean, they're traumatized by the purges, and you know, wherever you go, and the whole Yiddish culture had been co-opted by the Soviets and then abused as a horrible. You remember the famous trials of Judaism. I mean, they were utterly a community in shock. So
yeah.
They're not a good.
I think, but he talked about.
Sorry.
He talked about things like the Yiddish library.
Yeah.
They couldn't find enough money to keep it going in a good-sized town. Nobody was going to school in a Yiddish context or whatever, Hebraic. Things like that. That population levels were declining. All these sorts of people were impoverished. All sorts of things that.
Yeah. Well, he's not completely
down.
wrong about. He's not completely wrong about some of those things. It's true.
Yes.
Hello, it's Elizabeth Drew. Hello. With all the greatest respect, you ducked Jeffrey's, I think, really important question of why. Why the oppression over all these centuries? Your first example of the Greeks, they took their money. Is it the money thing, the money changers that runs through all this? Is it differentness? Is it looks? Which is kind of a joke. You know, Disraeli said Palestinians were Jews on horseback. They look exactly alike. They're very Semitic looking. What is it? Is it myth pile on myth that kept it going, or why?
Well, I suppose it is myth. I thought we did talk about that quite lengthily, actually. But no, it wasn't. But the money thing was not. I mean, the fact that they were Greek merchants, but it was nothing. The demonology was not about money at all. It was about actually secret victim sacrifice. It was kind of devil worship. It was the Romans who invented this myth in Alexandria, and that's a long history of the Jews being associated. But I mean, we spoke at length, maybe I wasn't making myself clear, about the sense in which when you have a social or cultural organization based on territory, you're going to deeply mistrust those who you've made out of, you know, your own policy, wanderers and marginal people, and people who have more than one allegiance to more than one place, and the most allegiance they have is to their own religion. They are going to be suspect. It's true with the Parsis. I mean, it's true that sort of syndrome is familiar. So I don't have any. I mean, that is, I think, and as I said, the Jews just sort of don't go away, and they sustain that. Christian demonology. Did you see the program last night? No, maybe you did. Okay, well, you know, I mean, what happens is very early on in the 4th century CE or AD, is that Jews are held to be literally a synagogue as a place where there are demons. I mean, actually, that Jews are actually in league with Satan. So it's not a Jewish problem; it's a Christian problem.
Yes, I've ignored to my right as I look to my left here. So, and maybe we'll have time for one more afterwards.
Simon, I haven't read your book, but do you talk about Jewish-Arab relations pre-Islam?
Yes. Yeah,
Jewish-Arab relations post-Islam?
In Arabia. Well, I talk about, there's a whole chapter called The Cohens of Arabia, which is actually about Arabia, Jewish Arabia before Islam. It's an incredibly interesting, as I'm sure you know, the whole story of the Kingdom of Himyar. There are ethnically Arab Jewish states. One huge state, the most important state in the Arabian Peninsula, is a place called the Kingdom of Himyar, roughly where Yemen is now. It's mostly ethnically Arab, and it's Orthodox, devout, passionately Jewish. And it's destroyed by a Christian Ethiopian battle the Aksumite kings in the year 525. Incredibly interesting. Essentially, it's only with third caliph Omar that Jews are physically, again, expelled from Arabia because, again, they obstinately won't accept Islam. But in, the town, city that became Medina was a town called Yathrib, which was nearly 70% Jewish, and where the Jews actually ran the markets, and they had date palm groves and so on. So there was a thriving Jewish-Arab world, actually, which wonderfully mixes, again, all our categories up, and which I spend quite a lot of time, resting on the work of brilliant recent scholarship. And then do I talk about, you said, post? Yeah, I do, because the Cairo Genizo is our great, extraordinary archive of what life under high medieval Islam was like, good and bad, and mostly good.
There's a wonderful scroll I came across many years ago in my own youthful wanderings in Istanbul in the Topkapi Palace of early expansion of Islam, going to one of those kinds of Jewish towns you're talking about, and the scroll says, fellow people of the book.
Yes, well,
and then of course it says surrender or die. I mean, emphasis on fellow people of the book was what grabbed me, and I've never forgotten.
No, it's a very complicated story because actually different clans and tribes in a city like Medina, but also in Khaybar, Muhammad's victory over Khaybar is absolutely a turning point for the success of his whole project. And there are many, many clans which are divided between pagan ethnic Arabs and Jewish Arabs, and the issue is which, and then Muhammad, of course, has his own. He's expelled from Mecca, so he was very interested in which side are the Jewish Arabs actually jumping towards, and a lot of grief and trouble happened as a result of that.
Okay,
they made bad
one
decisions.
more in the way.
It's a wonderful history and very gorgeously mixed up, really.
Thank you. I saw the show last night, and you tell in breathtaking detail the anti-Semitism, the early Christians, and the welcoming by the Islamic community. And of course, today you have an alliance, if you will, between many parts of the Christian community, evangelicals, and the State of Israel or Judaism. I'm going to confuse them, and a virulent hatred in some of the Muslim world. Do you see it as a stage that religions go through in terms of anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish feeling? And do you think today's views of both communities, Christian and Islam, are shaped more by Judaism or the State of Israel?
Oh, undoubtedly the State of Israel. I'm sorry to give you a short answer to that, but I think it's not, I don't, at least I haven't thought maybe about, kind of very general interpretation of the evolution of religions. And I mean, the problems I said slightly facetiously in the program last night was that for both Islam and Christianity, Judaism is the great grandpa religion, which sort of won't die off, but it's somehow obstinately stuck in its own value world, refuses to acknowledge the prophet in the case of Islam or the Savior in the case of Jesus. And so it's a kind of annoying anachronism, which nonetheless can't be destroyed entirely because its mere presence is supposed to be a kind of permanent witness to blindness and also has the potential to be converted. Particularly Christianity needs the Jews to be converted in order for the second coming of Christ to happen, so these kind of have to be physically kept around. So I don't want to have a kind of generalized evolutionary systemic view. I mean, the fact of Israel is really what determines it's not to say that there wasn't Judeophobia in Muslim societies before Zionism happened. There was. I mean, in the middle of this golden age of Muslim Spain, nearly the entire community of Granada, Jewish community, about 5,000 people were killed on 2 nights in 1066. So, there were bad moments, but overall, as I said last night, it was better to be in a Muslim society than a Christian society. Israel really changed kind of everything pretty much. And, there is the great issue of as many Jews were evicted from Muslim societies as Palestinians were from Palestine, 700,000 of them between 1948 and 1956. An extra complication because it's not your question, but some of the most intense enmity towards the Muslim world are from people whose families came out of it.
All right, I think we have to stop. Simon's going to stick around and sign books, right? Thank you very much.